automated podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, or you've checked out the website and read some of the blogs, you'll have noticed that every now and then I like to kind of take a step back from the more direct examples of automation, which are really typically showcased with the guests that I have on, and try to look at relevant connected issues to the topic of automation. So this week's episode will try to do just that, and look at the larger topic of data privacy and protection. So this is a topic that has been getting quite a lot of attention in recent years with events like Edward Snowden's whistleblowing or Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal, and of course the numerous data breaches that impact millions of people every single year. But more importantly, as I hope this podcast has been showing, as our world becomes both more digitized and more automated, data is becoming more and more central to the way the world operates. And thus vulnerability in both our businesses and, more importantly, I would think, our personal lives needs to be taken more seriously. So I'm sure that we have all been faced with a new app, software update, or even website we want to use, and instantly skip the lengthy, maybe even legally phrased user and data agreements. I myself, of course, am guilty of this as well. But I think that as time goes on, and as we continue to use more digital and automation tools, the instant acceptance of these agreements will become more and more important to reconsider, as well as data protection in general, which will be focused on more in this episode. So as I see it, there are really some three levels of concerns: kind of basic data theft, individual freedom or well-being, and I think a more unnerving future implication. I'll explore all three of these, but I think first it's important to set a bit of context as it relates to data. So I'm sure that over the last couple of years, I'm sure you've come across at least once the phrase that data is the new oil of the 21st century. So the phrase was first coined back in 2006, but it was really only in 2017 when The Economist published a story titled "The World's Most Valuable Resource is No Longer Oil, but Data," which really popularized this idea. And the concept behind this is that just like oil, raw data isn't really valuable in and of itself, but rather the value is created when it is gathered completely and accurately, connected to other relevant data, and done so in a timely manner. So when properly refined, usable data quickly becomes a decision-making tool, also known as information, which allows companies to react to market forces and be proactive and intentional in their decision-making. So really, as the titans of industry have shifted over the last 100 plus years from oil producers and other raw material-based organizations to the digital titans of today like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, etc., data is now seen as, of course, the more valuable asset. And there is no sign that this will stop. So we live in an ever-increasing digital world where both the digital and the real are being blended constantly. So the most obvious example is, of course, the smartphone revolution, which has given nearly the entire planet's population access to information and communication abilities that I think would be the envy of prior governments and even kings. So smart cities and smart homes are increasing our interaction with digital tools in our day-to-day lifestyle, requiring or even necessitating digital capabilities to get around, order and pay for goods, and even be involved in social events. And now we are seeing the encroachment of ever more immersive digital technologies like virtual reality or synthetic media entering both the home and the office. So needless to say, our society and lives are becoming more defined by our digital footprint every year, and the data that is generated is growing alongside this in both quantity and, of course, value. But as data use continues to grow, really what are the risks? And why is data privacy and protection so important? So over the last decade, billions of people have actually seen their personal data stolen in data breaches from various companies and platforms. As systems and platforms become larger and larger, a single breach can impact not a few million, but hundreds of millions of users at once. I think that the most obvious problem relating to this is the revealing of credit card and identity information, which is typically used by hackers. But also, really depending on the compromised system, lives can be negatively impacted in a multitude of different ways. So take, for example, the breach of the extramarital affairs platform Ashley Madison. So this was widely covered by news agencies and media outlets because of the more sensational aspect of the platform itself. But overall, the breach actually led to a number of extortions, public humiliations, and even a few suicides have been linked to it and the subsequent data release. So the popular data breaches typically impact individuals using a specific service, but as companies become more reliant on digital or automation tools, having their operational data stolen can also lead to a reduced competitive edge. However, more socially impactful was the watershed moment that really brought privacy issues to people's awareness. Cambridge Analytica. This was a data analysis firm, purchased Facebook data on tens of millions of Americans without their knowledge. The data in question was gathered using an app called This Is Your Digital Life that offered Facebook users personality quizzes. Those who downloaded the app voluntarily turned over personal data about what they like, where they live, and in some cases who their friends were. So of the 87 million people's data that was collected, 30 million psychological profiles were created to build a tool which was used on US voters to help elect Donald Trump as president. So how was this done? With these profiles, targeted advertisements could be used to suppress voting intentions. So a paper in 2013 warned of the consequences of such actions, essentially stating that they pose a threat to an individual's well-being, freedom, or even life. In retrospect, many have stated that by using Facebook's data like this, undermined the democratic system by stripping individual people of the ability to make unbiased decisions. In other words, by using data, profiles, and targeted advertisements, people's decision to vote could be manipulated one way or another, benefiting and possibly leading to the election of the candidate and party that had access to the most amount of data. And though highly problematic in and of itself, I think that it gets even worse if we zoom further out from the US context. So during the turmoil of the initial days of the pandemic, when focus was put onto the virus, one example of the importance of data privacy was really showcased with Hungary, where authoritarian powers were granted to the sitting prime minister, silencing any criticism of the government by jailing those deemed to spread misinformation. So as was voiced back in episode 26, the main fear that comes from this is that an authoritarian government, not respecting privacy concerns, can use data about individuals to ascertain political leanings or other ideological beliefs against the sitting power, and using that information to either silence or negatively impact individuals' lives. And I think that this is relevant to everyone as we see the larger trend of the decline of democracy across the world, even before the pandemic hit. So an annual country-by-country assessment of political rights and civil liberties released by Freedom House in March found that the share of countries designated not free has reached its highest level since the deterioration of democracy began in 2006, and that countries with declines in political rights and civil liberties outnumbered those with gains by the largest margin recorded during the last 15-year period. The report downgraded the freedom scores of 73 countries, representing 75% of the global population. So this is going to be problematic for most people on the planet, but something that has the potential to impact everyone who uses technology in the future might even be of greater concern. So the data discussed so far has been fairly peripheral to an individual's identity compared to what is coming next. Part of today's fourth industrial revolution holds that the lines between the physical, digital, and biological are being blurred and will continue further into the future. We are beginning to see this with the increased use of personal bio-trackers like Fitbits, smart rings, and smartwatches, and even greater sensor capabilities in our smartphones today. Furthermore, the coming wave of biosensors that will track our minute body functions like blood pressure, weight and calorie levels, hormone levels, vitamins, etc., all in the name of preventative health, will generate an entire new field of data with our most personal information. So the benefits of this are, of course, astounding. Early detection of cancer, monitoring glucose and insulin levels, long-term heart rate monitoring, all of it can detect, diagnose, and prevent and treat diseases unlike at any time before. But the risks are often less apparent. So the same issues hold true for the more peripheral data collection discussed before, but now with biological information, it is possible that people will be reducing life and health choices to fit the quantified list of check marks needed for optimal health performance, essentially losing touch with how to live life. Secondly, health insurance systems will have much more power in their ability to know which clients will be costly and which won't be. It is possible to see charging of premiums to those people with higher probabilities of having health issues in later years, even though currently appearing perfectly fine, based on, of course, the accumulated data. So this would exacerbate social and, of course, economic inequalities, as typically those with less personal wealth also deal with more health concerns. This power could also be leveraged by other corporations which are already hiring artificial intelligence to detect minute facial expressions in determining whether a candidate should get a job or not. Having access to personal health data, either through leaks like Cambridge Analytica or in a more open and legal context, would again put potential employees at a further disadvantage. As organizations really try to mitigate risk, and if potential health complications could be known beforehand, employers might not be willing to take on potential health problems from candidates. But moving on, lastly, when looking at the possible kind of final frontier of this trend, we arrive at a possibility existing more in the far future. So recently, Wired published a story of a robotic arm that could twist, grasp, and feel when being controlled by the operator. The catch was that the man had been completely paralyzed since he was 19 and was controlling the robot simply by thinking about actions that were then relayed to the robot through a surgically implanted number of electrodes in his brain. This isn't new. Companies like Neuralink have been popularizing brain-computer interface, or BCI, technology already for a few years. The problem is as simple as it is profound, though. Data can now be generated about what and how we are thinking. Though BCI is still, of course, at a very early stage, the examples of data breaches, Cambridge Analytica, changing national freedom levels, bio-tracking issues, and of course, hiring AI should put us at some level of unease with regards to generating more personal data without greater degrees of privacy and protection, especially data that is coming directly from our brains. Thankfully, there are initiatives today that are growing in response to events like Cambridge Analytica, such as Europe's GDPR, Apple's stronger stance on privacy features, California's Consumer Rights Act, and even China has new data security initiatives that are on the way. And there are many, many more out there. In a 2020 report, Gartner projected that 65% of the world's population will have its personal information covered under privacy regulation by 2023, up from just 10% in early 2021. But I think that even with this positive news, I think it's still up to individuals and organizations to think about data privacy as technologies and, of course, automated digital tools enter our lives more and more. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, there are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.